All right, so in this video, I'm going to go through the solutions to the IB Economics Higher Level Paper 1. This is for the October/November 2022 paper. And so in a previous video, we had already gone, So in the previous video, we've gone through the solutions for question 1, both parts. And in this video, I'm going to go through the solutions for question 2, part A, which is this guy over here. And this thing is worth 10 marks. Right, so let's have a quick read of the questions. The question's up here. It's asking us to explain why a sustainable level of government, i.e. national debt, is an important macroeconomic objective. Right, so let's break this question down. So this question is about debt. So if I sort of highlight this thing over here, specifically it's about government debt and why it's important to maintain a sustainable level of this debt. Now, we can think about debt from your own personal situation. If you borrow money, like for whatever reason, you have to make sure you can pay it back. This includes both the principal, which is how much you borrowed, plus any interest payments on top of that principal. If your income is greater than the repayments, then your debt is sustainable. But if you keep on taking more debt, then eventually your repayments will exceed your income, and this becomes unsustainable because you simply have no way to pay it back. So that's what this question is really about. When the government takes on debt, i.e. when it borrows money, it needs to ensure that the repayments do not exceed its income. If it borrows too much, then the only way to pay it back would be to increase taxes at some future point or cut spending on public goods and services like healthcare and education. Make sense? Now, on top of this, if the government is not careful, it can also introduce inflation into the economy if their spending exceeds what the economy is able to produce. But I'll explain this later using a diagram. Okay, so before we begin, as usual, I like to have like these little headings or mini sections which will give us this rough plan for how we're going to tackle this problem. So the first section is here on key terms, and here I've got government debt, obviously. Then we should talk about budget deficits, GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio, which is an important indicator of debt relative to national income. Next, we're going to include a little diagram over here. Then a bit of a section on theory and explanation. And finally, we'll finish off with a couple of real-world examples. All right, so coming back to this section here on key terms. The first one we've got is government, i.e. national debt. And this is the total amount of money that a government owes to external and internal creditors accumulated from borrowing to cover budget deficits. National debt grows when the government spending exceeds revenues. So next we have we've got budget deficit. So this occurs when a government's expenditures surpass its revenues within a fiscal year. A budget deficit leads to borrowing, adding to national debt. Next, we've got this like the GDP, which you should probably know what this means by now, but we should probably define it nonetheless. So GDP is the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. Government debt is often measured as a percentage of GDP to assess sustainability. And lastly, we have the debt to GDP ratio, which is a key measure of the sustainability of a country's debt. indicating the proportion of national debt relative to the size of the economy. A high ratio suggests that a country may struggle to service its debt. Right, so that about does it for, I think, the key terms. So as long as we've got something like that or something along those lines, I think that's sufficient. Let's move on to the next bit where we perhaps will draw a diagram to explain, to explain what some of these concepts. Right, so in this diagram, we're going to use an aggregate demand and supply model. Just let me draw the diagram. So as you're aware, with the aggregate demand supply model, we have aggregate demand. I'll give us two different aggregate demand curves. No, actually, I'll use three later on. And then we have this aggregate supply curve, or rather the long run aggregate supply curve. 8.B, we'll go P1, P2, and I'll explain what all this means in a second. That should be P3. Just clean this up a little bit. We have something like inflation or prices, and we have something like, let's say, our GDP over here, which we're going to use the letter Y, and say Y1 and Y2. Right, so in this diagram, I've got the aggregate demand supply model. Here, we're going to include the aggregate demand curve as well as a long run aggregate supply curve, which becomes vertical as the economy approaches its full or potential level of output. Now, I'm going to assume you've already covered this model of aggregate demand and supply in your coursework. If not, you need to go back and review this material before proceeding. All right, so down here, I've just got like a little, just some notes to annotate this diagram. Right, so what I've got here is I've said that an increasing, so just again, we're going to need like a few, just a bit of commentary to explain what this diagram is about. So here we're saying that an increase in government debt, often driven by fiscal stimulus, affects aggregate demand. So there's three, it's a three-step thing. Initially, we have initial equilibrium, and in initial equilibrium, in the short run, the economy is in equilibrium at price level P1 and output level Y1. Just gotta fix up the output level Y1. Where aggregate demand exceeds intersects with aggregate supply. So in step one, we have this initial equilibrium given by point A, and you can see that sort of price level is at P1 and output level is at Y1. Then what's going to happen is that if the government were to borrow money for fiscal expansion, that's probably going to increase aggregate demand from 81 to 82, and the equilibrium is going to move from point A to point B. So we need some commentary to explain what's happening here. Suppose the government borrows to fund increased spending. Shifting AD from 81 to 82. It's a terrible job. AD from 81 to 82. This boosts demand leading to higher output, Y2, and a higher price level, P2. Right, so we have initially, when we increase this fiscal expansion and aggregate demand moves from 81 to 82, and we go from, let's say, point A to point B, we have a little bit of inflation as prices move from P1 to P2. But then what happens is that if we keep further expanding, if we keep borrowing money to fund further expansion, so if the government just to simply spend even more, then that's going to move aggregate demand from, let's say, 82 to 83. We're going to go from, let's say, point B to C, and now we're going to have way more inflation from P to P3 as the economy approaches that long run maximum, or that potential level of output, and we simply just can't supply anymore. So we need some commentary to explain that as well. So step 3, this leads to sort of potential for inflation. If the economy is near full capacity, additional demand might, say, from 82 to 83, will only push prices higher without significantly increasing output, potentially leading to inflationary pressures. This inflation gap highlights why government borrowing, if excessive, can harm the economy. Right, so I think that kind of does it for the diagram bit, right? So I've got like this diagram, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Again, if you're not familiar with this, you need to go back and review your notes. But I think we've got a diagram. It's annotated, and we've got like a little bit of commentary explaining what the diagram is. I think the diagram's done. We can now move on. So in this next section, we're going to have a little bit of discussion on some of the theory and explanation. And we're going to look at the debt to GDP ratio as an indicator of national debt and explain what sustainable and unsustainable debt means, as well as some of the factors that affect that level of sustainability, such as interest rates. So here I'm going to start by saying, so we talk about government debt as a percentage. So we'll say government debt as a percentage of GDP is calculated as debt to GDP ratio total government debt, gross domestic product, all right, so here we're defining this thing called the debt to GDP ratio, which is an important indicator of government debt. And we're saying that it's the way we calculate the debt to GDP ratio is that we take the total amount of government debt that's owed, we divide it by the nation's GDP, multiplied by 100. For example, if a country has national debt of $1 trillion and a GDP of $2 trillion, its debt to GDP ratio would be 50%. A ratio above 100% means a country's debt exceeds its annual GDP, which could signal an unsustainable debt burden. Right, so now we've got this, I think, sort of brief explanation of what government, how we measure government debt using the debt to GDP ratio. Now, I think, we should probably talk about budget deficits. The budget deficit is the annual shortfall between government spending and revenue. When a government runs a deficit, it borrows money by issuing bonds, which increases the national debt. If deficits persist year after year, the debt continues to rise. All right, so what is sustainable debt? Well, sustainable debt means that a government can meet its debt obligations, interest payments, and principal repayment without harming economic growth. The sustainability of debt largely depends on debt servicing costs, which are the interest payments a government makes on its debt. If a government borrows at low interest rates, it can sustain higher levels of debt. For example, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is over 200%, but low interest rates keep its debt servicing manageable. If interest payments on debt grow faster than GDP, the government may have to increase taxes or cut spending to avoid default. In contrast, if GDP grows faster than debt, the debt to GDP ratio can decline, making the debt more sustainable. Okay, so now we've discussed what sustainable debt means and some of the factors that affect it. So the main thing about sustainable debt is that as long as you can, whatever income you have is enough to pay back your debt repayments, and this includes both the principal as well as the interest payments, then this is considered to be sustainable. Some of the factors that affect that sustainability include things like interest rates. So if interest rates are fairly low, then that means you can borrow more, but if interest rates are high, that means you borrow less. Because obviously that's going to add to your repayments. Now, in the next bit, we're going to talk about what unsustainable debt means. Countries with unsustainable debt risk a downgrade in their credit rating, which is an assessment by rating agencies of a country's ability to repay its debt. A low credit rating increases borrowing costs as lenders demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk. So an example would include a country like Greece during the European debt crisis. During the European debt crisis, Greece's credit rating was downgraded, making it difficult and expensive for the government to borrow. A downgraded credit rating not only increases borrowing costs, but also signals to investors that a country is a higher risk, potentially leading to capital flight. Higher levels of debt can force governments to raise taxes or cut spending in the future to service this debt. This can have long-term effects. So the first of these long-term effects would be like higher taxes. Right? So if you're borrowing money at an unsustainable rate, then at some point you're gonna have to find ways to repay that debt. So one of these ways includes higher taxes. Increased taxes reduce disposable income for households and profits for businesses, leading to lower consumption and investment, which can reduce economic growth. The second sort of problem with these high levels of debt is that perhaps governments will have to, if they increase taxes or they reduce spending. A large portion of government budgets may be directed towards interest payments, reducing the funds available for essential services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure investment. High debt levels can burden future generations with the obligation to pay for today's spending. This raises questions of fairness, as future taxpayers may have to bear the costs of debts they did not benefit from. Right, so not only do these high levels of debt affect current generations, they can also affect future generations as well. And then so future generations have to pay for the spending of people from this generation. So that's also considered to be unfair. All right, so these are some of the consequences of unsustainable debt. Now, in this very last section, we're going to finish off with some real-world examples, and a couple of cases come to mind, and these include the United States and Greece during the European debt crisis, as previously mentioned. The US has a relatively high debt to GDP ratio, above 100%, but it is considered sustainable due to its strong economy, ability to borrow in its own currency, and low interest rates on US Treasury bonds. However, if interest rates rise or growth slows, servicing costs could become problematic. Now, the other example so this is an example of, quote unquote, potentially sustainable debt. So in the US, they do have high levels of debt, but because their economy is quite strong and, they've got low interest rates, this might mean that their debt serviceability is not really that negatively affected, but they are at risk should interest rates rise. The other example I can think of unsustainable debt would be what happened in Greece during the European debt crisis. In the late 2000s, Greece's debt became unsustainable. Its debt to GDP ratio exceeded 130%, and its economy could not generate enough growth or revenue to service the debt. The country had to seek bailouts from the European Union and International Monetary Fund, and it implemented severe austerity measures. And there you have it. So I think that is perhaps sort of like a textbook answer to the question, probably more than what's required. If we kind of review, we went through all the sort of steps. We sort of defined a bunch of key terms, which I think are relevant to the current problem. We had like a little diagram, as well as some commentary explaining the diagram. We had a section discussing sort of the relevant theory, as well as some explanation behind that theory. And we finished off by looking at a couple of real-world examples. So this is the kind of format that the examiners are looking for. If you're able to sort of produce something similar to this, then yeah, you should get like a really good outcome. Okay, so that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.